I never thought I'd have to choose between my children. At 71, I'd buried my wife, watched my grandchild grow, and believed the worst pain of my life was behind me. Then I found my daughter's phone that evening, forgotten on the table. One glance at those text messages changed everything. Tell them he pushed you, wear the torn blouse, and don't forget to cry in court. My own daughter was coaching my former daughter-in-law to lie about domestic violence that never happened, all to destroy my son. What would you do if the truth could save one child, but condemn another? As the custody hearing approached, I discovered layers of betrayal, decades of hidden resentment and secrets that would shatter our family forever. When I finally stood in that courtroom with evidence in my hands, I realized the most devastating truth of all. Sometimes loving your children means making choices that break your heart. If you've ever had to choose between what's right and what's easy, if you've ever wondered what lies beneath the surface of the families around you, or if you've ever been invisible in your own home, this story might just change how you see the people you thought you knew best. Follow this channel, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because some family secrets deserve to be heard. My name is Walter Johnston. I'm 71 years old now, and if you're listening to this, it's because I've got nothing left to lose anymore. They say old men like me shouldn't cry. I didn't even shed a tear when I buried Margaret, my wife of 43 years. But that day, God help me, I cried. I cried from anger, from fear, from a shame so deep it felt like my soul was being torn apart. It happened in my daughter Meredith's living room, where everything seemed so ordinary. The smell of day-old coffee lingering in the air, the grandfather clock in the corner ticking away at exactly 6:07 in the evening, and her cell phone, just sitting there, forgotten on that antique oak table her mother and I had given her when she bought the house. I don't know exactly why I picked it up. Maybe because she'd always been so protective of it, always telling me, "Dad, don't touch my things." Maybe because something inside me was already screaming, "Look, Walter, look before it's too late." The screen lit up with a notification. A WhatsApp conversation was open. My hands trembled as I read the first message, then the second, then all of them. My own daughter was coaching my former daughter-in-law Stephanie on how to lie, how to tell the court that my son, my own flesh and blood James, was a violent man, how to fabricate a version of events that never happened. Wear that torn blouse tomorrow. Tell them he grabbed you so hard it ripped. And don't forget to cry. The tears are important, Steph. If you don't cry, the judge won't believe you. In that moment, the world stopped spinning. The sounds of suburban Philadelphia faded away outside the window. The clock seemed to freeze, and I couldn't tell anymore if my family had already died long ago, or if I was the one who'd been buried alive all this time without realizing it. I scrolled down further, my arthritic fingers fumbling with the screen. If he asks about witnesses, say you were always alone when it happened. Say he was careful that way. Tell them about the time he pushed you in the kitchen. Remember, it was right after Thanksgiving dinner last year. But there was no time after Thanksgiving. James wasn't even in town last Thanksgiving. He was working in Pittsburgh, 300 miles away. They were fabricating a history of abuse that never existed, creating wounds that were never inflicted. And for what? The custody of my 7-year-old grandson, Ethan. I sat down heavily in Meredith's floral armchair, the one that used to be in our family home, the one where I'd read bedtime stories to both Meredith and James when they were children. My knees gave out beneath me as another message appeared on the screen. "Dad's coming over for dinner tonight. Make sure he doesn't see your phone. He still thinks James walks on water." I heard the front door open, keys jingling in the lock, Meredith's voice calling out, "Dad, are you here already?" Carefully, with hands that had once defused bombs in Vietnam, I placed the phone back exactly where it had been. I arranged my face into something resembling normalcy, but inside something fundamental had broken, something that could never be repaired. When Meredith walked in, she had no idea that her father had just died in that chair. The man who greeted her with a forced smile was just a shell, an old man carrying a secret that would eventually tear our family apart at the seams. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Just got here a minute ago." That night, as we ate pot roast and talked about nothing important, I made a decision. I would not be silent. I would not look away. For the first time in my life, I would stand against my own daughter, because sometimes love means choosing truth, even when it destroys everything you hold dear. I just didn't know yet how much it would cost me. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. The ceiling fan in my modest apartment spun lazily above me, casting strange shadows across the walls as my mind raced through dark corridors of thought. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed an angry red. 2:17 a.m., then 3:42, then 4:56. Each minute crawled by like an eternity. I remembered the day Meredith was born, how I'd held that tiny bundle in my trembling hands and promised I would always protect her. How James had peered into her crib with curious 5-year-old eyes and solemnly vowed to be the best big brother ever. The memory tasted bitter now, like coffee left too long on the burner. "Dad, you don't know anything," Meredith had told me just last month over Sunday brunch at Rosie's Diner on Lancaster Avenue. She'd stabbed at her eggs with unusual force, her fork scraping against the ceramic plate. "You've always thought James was perfect." She was right, I didn't know. I didn't know she harbored such deep hatred for her own brother. I didn't know she was capable of manipulating someone as fragile as Stephanie, who'd always struck me as a delicate creature, prone to anxiety and bouts of melancholy. I didn't know my own daughter anymore. But in that moment after discovering the messages, I pretended. I pretended I hadn't seen anything. I pretended my world wasn't collapsing. I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it, carefully, like returning a venomous snake to its enclosure. And then I left, like a coward, smiling through dinner while my heart turned to stone in my chest. That night, alone in my bed, her words hammered in my head like gunshots. "If he gets away with this, we'll lose everything. Tell them he screamed at you in public at that restaurant on New Year's Eve. Remember to mention how he grabbed your wrist so hard it left marks." Lies. All lies. I knew my son. Not perfect, no. He had his father's temper sometimes, quick to flare but just as quick to fade. He worked too much, drank a bit too much sometimes when the pressure got to him. But violent? Never. I'd stake my life on it. Why? That was the question that kept me staring at the ceiling as the night bled away. Why such hatred? What had happened between them that I hadn't seen? What currents had been flowing beneath the surface of our family all these years while I remained oblivious, focused on my career as a structural engineer, then later on caring for Margaret as cancer slowly took her? And more hauntingly, what had I done or failed to do that had shaped Meredith into someone who could do this? I got up around 5:30, my joints protesting as I shuffled to the kitchen, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, sat at my small kitchen table, the same one where James and Meredith had done their homework decades ago. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the worn formica. An old photo hung on the refrigerator door. Our last family vacation before Margaret got sick. Cape May, summer of 2011. All of us smiling. James with his arm around Stephanie, who was pregnant with Ethan at the time. Meredith looking carefree in a way I hadn't seen in years. What had changed? When had the smiles become masks hiding darker truths? I pulled out my phone, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy as I texted James, "Need to talk. Important. Come by tomorrow morning if you can." He replied almost immediately despite the early hour. "Everything okay, Dad? I can come now if it's an emergency." Always the responsible one. Always worried about his old man. "Tomorrow is fine," I texted back. "Just need your advice on something." A small lie to hide the grenade I was about to roll into the center of our lives. I showered, the hot water doing nothing to wash away the dread that had settled into my bones. Dressed in the same clothes I'd worn yesterday, barely noticing. Made another cup of coffee I didn't drink. And then I made a decision. I would not confront Meredith directly. Not yet. I needed evidence that couldn't be deleted with the swipe of a finger. Something tangible. Something irrefutable. I opened my laptop, an ancient thing James had been trying to get me to replace for years. I searched how to take screenshots of text messages, found a tutorial, printed it out because I didn't trust myself to remember the steps. Tomorrow I would find a way to get access to that phone again, to document what I'd seen, to preserve the proof before it vanished. But as I sat there, watching the sun climb higher over the Philadelphia skyline, a different question formed in my mind. One even more terrifying than the others. What if I was wrong? What if, somehow, James really had done these things? What if my love for my son had blinded me to a truth I couldn't bear to see? The doubt crept in like fog, clouding my certainty, making me question everything I thought I knew about my children, my family, and myself. I spent that entire night wide awake, my old bones aching against the mattress as I sat propped up against a wall of pillows. The ancient Dell laptop, a retirement gift from my engineering firm back in 2015, hummed loudly on my thighs. The blue light from the screen cast an eerie glow across my bedroom, making the familiar space feel alien and cold. Outside, rain pattered against the windows, a soft rhythm that normally would have lulled me to sleep, but now only served as background music to my nightmare. My hands shook as I worked, not just from age or the arthritis that had been creeping into my joints for the past decade, but from the weight of what I was doing. Each message I opened felt like opening another door in a house where all the rooms were on fire. If the judge asks about specific incidents, mention the Christmas party at his office. Say he cornered you in the bathroom and threatened you when you said you wanted to leave early. I remembered that party. I had been there. James and Stephanie had left early because Ethan had a fever, and James had been worried sick about his son. He'd thanked the hosts, helped Stephanie with her coat, and they'd left together, his hand gently supporting her back. No arguments, no threats, just a concerned father and husband wanting to get home to care for their child. Another lie, another fabrication. I took screenshots, meticulously, one by one. The process was painfully slow with my limited technical abilities. Several times I had to start over when I accidentally closed a window or pressed the wrong button. The clock on my nightstand ticked relentlessly forward, 1:17 a.m., 2:34 a.m., 3:46 a.m. as I worked. If he tries to say he was at work during any of these times, remember that he could have left the office without anyone knowing. Don't let him use his co-workers as alibis. They had thought of everything. Every potential defense my son might offer, every fact he might present to prove his innocence. They had a counter ready, a way to twist it or dismiss it. I opened a Word document and began to paste the screenshots into it, adding notes about what I knew to be true. The Christmas party. The Thanksgiving dinner James hadn't even attended. The supposed incident at Rittenhouse Square where he had grabbed her arm so hard it left bruises, on a day when I knew for a fact he had been with me, helping to fix my leaking roof. Each line I read felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My daughter, my little girl who had once sat on my lap and asked me to explain how rainbows worked, was orchestrating a campaign of lies to destroy her brother. And not just any lies. Lies about violence. Lies that could send him to jail, cost him his job as a high school physics teacher, and, perhaps most devastating of all, separate him from his son. Remember to bring up how afraid Ethan is of him, how he hides when James raises his voice. The child psychologist will be looking for signs of trauma. This was perhaps the cruelest lie of all. Ethan adored his father. I had countless photos of them together, building model rockets, fishing at the lake house, James patiently helping him with his first-grade math homework. The boy's face always shone with the same expression when he looked at his father, pure love and trust. The thought of someone poisoning that relationship made my stomach turn. Around 4:30 a.m., I finished documenting everything. My eyes burned from exhaustion, and my back had locked up into a painful knot. But I had what I needed. 57 pages of evidence, all neatly organized and annotated. I hit print and listened to the ancient printer in my home office wheeze and clatter to life in the pre-dawn darkness. While the pages slowly emerged, I went to my closet and pulled out an old red folder, the same one I had used decades ago when I was working on the Franklin Bridge project, the one that had made my reputation in the engineering world. It seemed fitting somehow. That project had been about building something to connect people. This folder would now hold the evidence that might tear my family apart forever. The printed pages were still warm as I carefully slid them into the folder, the paper crisp between my fingertips. When I closed it, I sat there for a long moment staring at the red cover, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was heavier than it should have been. Heavy with betrayal, with broken trust, with the impossible choice that now lay before me. Because that was the terrible truth I had to face as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through my curtains. To save my son, I would have to sacrifice my daughter. If I showed these messages to a judge, to a lawyer, to anyone in authority, Meredith could face serious consequences. Conspiracy to commit perjury, witness tampering, perhaps even criminal charges, my own child, my little girl. But if I stayed silent, if I let this travesty of justice continue, James would lose everything. His reputation, his career, his child, his freedom. I placed the red folder on my bedside table and finally lay down. though sleep was as far away as the moon. The ceiling above me blurred as tears filled my eyes. For the first time since Margaret had died, I found myself wishing she were here, not for comfort, but for guidance. She had always been the moral compass of our family, the one who could see through complications to the clear right path. "What would you do, Maggie?" I whispered to the empty room. "What would you do?" But there was no answer, only the sound of rain, and the weight of a decision no father should ever have to make. The next day, I drove to Stephanie's apartment in Chestnut Hill. It was a modest two-bedroom in one of those pre-war buildings with ornate moldings and creaky hardwood floors. The kind of place where sound travels through walls like they're made of paper. I'd helped them move in 3 years ago, when Ethan was just 4. I remembered how James had carried his son on his shoulders as they explored each room, both of them laughing as Ethan's little hands brushed against the ceiling. Now, as I parked my old Buick in the visitor's spot, those memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life, a happier one that had ended abruptly the moment I'd picked up Meredith's phone. I sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the building's brick facade. What was I doing here? What did I hope to accomplish? The red folder lay on the passenger seat beside me, a silent accuser. I hadn't planned to bring it, but at the last minute I'd grabbed it, a talisman of truth in a situation drowning in lies. Finally, I forced myself to get out of the car. My knees protested as I stood, and I leaned heavily on my cane. Not the one I need all the time, but the one Margaret had insisted I use on bad days. Today qualified as the worst kind of bad day. Stephanie answered the door on the third knock. She looked terrible, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing an oversized Penn State sweatshirt that I recognized as James's. For a split second, confusion crossed her face, then something else. Fear? Guilt? It was gone before I could be sure. "Walter," she said, her voice unnaturally high. "We weren't expecting you." "I was in the neighborhood," I lied. "Thought I'd stop by and see my grandson." Her eyes darted past me to the hallway as if checking if I'd come alone. "Of course, come in. Ethan will be so happy to see you." The apartment was tidier than I expected, given her frazzled appearance. A stack of Dr. Seuss books sat on the coffee table. The smell of chicken nuggets lingered in the air. Normal, ordinary, except nothing was normal or ordinary anymore. "Ethan," Stephanie called, her voice strained. "Look who's here!" My grandson emerged from his bedroom and my heart clenched at the sight of him. He was in his dinosaur pajamas, though it was nearly noon. His dark hair, so like his father's, stuck up in cowlicks, and his Captain America socks were mismatched. But it was his expression that gutted me. He was quieter than usual, subdued in a way that 7-year-old boys rarely are. "Grandpa," he said, and for a moment his face lit up. He ran to me, wrapping his skinny arms around my waist, pressing his face against my cardigan. I felt him trembling slightly, and something inside me broke a little more. "Hey, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. "How's my favorite paleontologist doing today?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took my hand and led me to the couch, a serious look on his little face. "I made you something," he said softly. He went to his room and returned with a piece of construction paper. It was a drawing done in crayon with the careful concentration only children can muster. A house with 4 stick figures standing in front. One was clearly a man without facial features, just blank space where a face should be. Beside him was a woman with blue teardrops streaming down her cheeks. Next to her was a small girl with bright blue hair, and at the edge stood an elderly man with a cane and a downturned mouth. I studied it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The faceless man must be James. The crying woman, Stephanie. But who was the blue-haired girl? And why had Ethan drawn his father without a face? "It's beautiful," I said, though my heart was pounding. "Can you tell me about it?" Ethan glanced at his mother, who had busied herself in the kitchen, seemingly out of earshot. He leaned close to me, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Grandpa, it's us. And that's you." He pointed to the old man figure. "Mommy says Daddy is bad." His voice hitched slightly. But I remember him laughing with us. He made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. The simple statement hit me like a physical blow. What had they been telling this child? What poison had they been dripping into his ear about the father who adored him? I pulled Ethan closer, feeling his small body against mine. He seemed so fragile suddenly, so vulnerable to the adult chaos swirling around him. "Your daddy loves you very much," I said. careful to keep my voice steady. Don't ever forget that. Stephanie reappeared with a glass of iced tea for me, her smile too bright, too forced. He's been having a tough time, she said. The therapist says it's normal, given the circumstances. Therapist? This was the first I'd heard of Ethan seeing a therapist. What else didn't I know? I sipped the tea, buying time as doubts crept in like fog. What had really happened in this apartment in the months since James had moved out? What had Ethan seen or heard? What if, the thought made my stomach turn, what if I was wrong? What if James really had done something and I was blind to it because he was my son? But no, the messages I'd seen were clear. They were coaching Stephanie to lie, to fabricate incidents that never happened. I'd been present for some of the times they claimed abuse had occurred. I knew the truth, didn't I? As I sat there watching Ethan return to a half-finished Lego creation on the floor, the certainty I'd felt when printing those messages began to waver. The world suddenly seemed fluid, facts bending like light through water. What was real? What was manipulation? What was a father's blind love for his children, both his children, coloring his perception? I left an hour later, the red folder still unopened in my car. Ethan had hugged me tightly at the door, as if afraid I might disappear. "Come back soon, Grandpa," he'd whispered, and I'd promised I would, though I had no idea what kind of world we'd all be living in by then. As I drove home through the rain-slicked streets of Philadelphia, one thought kept circling in my mind. What if we were all lying to ourselves in different ways for different reasons? What if the truth was something none of us was ready to face? The morning of the custody hearing dawned with an oppressive August heat that seemed to press down on all Philadelphia like a heavy blanket. I woke before my alarm, my body stiff from another night of fitful sleep. The red folder sat on my dresser where I'd left it, seeming to glow in the early morning light filtering through my blinds. I'd made my decision sometime in the darkness of night. I would give the folder to Judge Hernandez. I would tell him everything. It would destroy Meredith, perhaps irreparably damage my relationship with her forever. But I couldn't let an innocent man, my son, lose his child because of fabricated accusations. My hands trembled as I knotted my tie, navy blue with small silver diamonds, a Father's Day gift from James years ago. In the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized myself. The man staring back at me looked ancient, hollowed out, the lines around his eyes and mouth carved deeper by the weight of the past few days. I arrived at the Montgomery County Courthouse an hour early. The imposing limestone building stood like a sentinel in the morning sun, its steps already crowded with people despite the early hour. I clutched the red folder like a lifeline as I slowly climbed those steps, each one seeming higher than the last. Inside, the air conditioning was a shock against my skin, raising goosebumps along my arms. The marble floors echoed with footsteps and muted conversations as people hurried to their respective hearings, their lives intersecting briefly in this temple of judgment before diverging again. I found courtroom 3B and settled onto a hard wooden bench outside. The red folder sat heavily on my lap as I watched the parade of humanity flowing past. Lawyers in expensive suits, anxious-looking families, court officers with their badges and stern expressions. "Mr. Johnston?" I looked up to find a woman standing before me. She was perhaps 40, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes behind simple glasses. She wore blue scrubs beneath a light cardigan. "Yes?" I replied, confusion momentarily displacing my anxiety. "I'm Nina Callahan," she said, sitting beside me without waiting for an invitation. "I work with Stephanie at Pennsylvania Hospital. I'm a nurse in pediatric oncology." The words registered slowly like they were being filtered through thick fog. "Pediatric oncology?" I repeated. "I don't understand." Nina glanced around, then leaned closer, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "I know I shouldn't be here. I know I shouldn't be talking to you, but I can't sleep at night knowing what's happening." My heart began to pound so loudly, I was certain she could hear it. "What is happening?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry as sandpaper. Nina's eyes darted nervously down the hallway before returning to mine. "Stephanie doesn't want to do this," she said. "The whole domestic violence claim. It wasn't her idea." "I know," I said quietly. "I've seen the messages." Her eyebrows rose slightly in surprise, but she continued. "Meredith promised to pay for Lily's treatment if Stephanie went along with it. She said it was the only way to make sure James would never get custody." "Lily?" The name felt foreign on my tongue. "Who is Lily?" Nina's expression shifted to one of confusion. Stephanie's daughter, her 5-year-old, from her first marriage. The world tilted beneath me. Stephanie had another child? A daughter? How could I not know this? James had never mentioned a stepdaughter. I don't understand, I said again, feeling suddenly untethered from reality. James never told me about another child. Nina's face softened with what looked like pity. Mr. Johnston, Lily has been in and out of CHOP for the past year. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The treatments are experimental and Stephanie's insurance won't cover them. They're incredibly expensive. My mind raced, trying to process this new information, to fit it into the narrative I'd constructed. If Stephanie had a sick daughter who needed expensive treatment, if Meredith had offered to pay for that treatment in exchange for her cooperation in this custody battle, was my daughter doing all this for money? Or was she trying to help a sick child get the treatment she needed? And if so, why not just help Stephanie directly? Why orchestrate this elaborate scheme to destroy James? I have to go, Nina said suddenly, standing as she spotted someone down the hallway. I thought you should know. Stephanie isn't a bad person. She's desperate. Her daughter is dying, and Meredith offered her a lifeline. She walked away quickly, disappearing into the growing crowd of people now filling the hallway. I sat there stunned, the red folder suddenly feeling heavier than before. Could I still go through with this? Could I expose the lies and manipulation, knowing that doing so might condemn a 5-year-old girl to death? A child I'd never even met, never even known existed until this moment? The moral clarity I'd felt earlier evaporated like morning dew under the harsh sun of this new reality. What had seemed like a simple choice between truth and lies, between right and wrong, had transformed into something infinitely more complex. The courthouse clock ticked relentlessly forward. In 30 minutes, we would all be in that courtroom. James with his attorney looking confident despite the dark circles under his eyes. Stephanie perhaps looking over at Meredith for reassurance before delivering her carefully rehearsed testimony. And Meredith, my daughter, what would I see in her eyes when I looked at her now? I opened the red folder one last time, staring at the evidence I'd so meticulously compiled. The words seemed to swim before my eyes, rearranging themselves into new patterns, new meanings. Mr. Johnston? A court officer stood before me. Are you here for the Jameson-Johnston custody hearing? I nodded, unable to form words. They're ready for you inside. I closed the folder and stood, my knees protesting, my back aching. The weight of decision pressed down on me like a physical force as I took my first step toward the courtroom doors. What was I going to do? Was I about to condemn my daughter to save my son? Or was I about to condemn a sick child to save my own conscience? The doubt had become a hammer in my mind, pounding against the walls of certainty I'd built. And as I walked into that courtroom, I honestly didn't know which path I would choose. I couldn't go through with it. Not yet. Not without confronting Meredith first. After the preliminary hearing, where both attorneys simply set dates and established the framework for the custody battle to come, I caught Meredith in the courthouse parking lot. The August heat shimmered off the asphalt, creating wavering mirages between the rows of cars. She was walking quickly, her heels clicking against the pavement, dark sunglasses hiding her eyes despite the overcast sky. We need to talk, I said, my voice cracking slightly as I approached her. Now. She turned, startled by my tone. I'd never spoken to her like that before, with authority bordering on anger. For a moment I saw a flicker of the little girl who used to climb into my lap after scraping her knee seeking comfort, but it vanished quickly, replaced by the mask of cold determination I'd grown accustomed to seeing lately. Dad, I have a meeting in 20 minutes, she said, checking her watch. A Rolex, I noticed, that hadn't been there the last time we'd had lunch. Can this wait? No, I said firmly. It can't. Something in my expression must have alarmed her, because she nodded slowly and gestured toward her Audi. Let's sit in my car. It's too hot out here. The air conditioning inside her car was almost painfully cold after the suffocating heat outside. The leather seats were immaculate. Not a crumb or coffee stain in sight. So different from my old Buick with its worn upholstery and lingering smell of the peppermints Margaret had always kept in the console. I know what you're doing, I said without preamble, turning to face her. I saw the messages on your phone. I know you're coaching Stephanie to lie about James. Her reaction was nothing like I expected. No shock, no denial, no defensive anger. Instead, a strange calm seemed to settle over her. She removed her sunglasses slowly, folding them deliberately before placing them in the cup holder between us. "I wondered if you'd seen that," she said quietly. "You've been acting strange since that night at my house." "Strange?" I repeated incredulously. "You're orchestrating false accusations of domestic violence against your own brother, and I'm acting strange?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, with eyes so like her mother's it made my chest ache. "Did you talk to Nina?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. My surprise must have shown on my face. "I thought so," Meredith continued. "She's been having second thoughts, but she doesn't understand what's at stake." "And what exactly is at stake, Meredith?" I demanded, anger finally breaking through my shock. "A 5-year-old girl I didn't even know existed until today? A child with cancer whose treatment you're using as leverage to destroy your brother?" A flash of genuine surprise crossed her face. "Is that what Nina told you? That I'm using Lily's treatment as blackmail?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course that's what she'd think. It's simpler that way, isn't it? Makes me the villain in this story." "Then explain it to me," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Make me understand why you would do this." Meredith was silent for a long moment, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. Then, without a word, she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out an envelope. It was creased and worn, as if it had been opened and refolded many times. "I wasn't going to give you this," she said, turning it over in her hands. "I wrote it after I found out what you'd seen on my phone, but I didn't think I'd have the courage to actually give it to you." She handed me the envelope. My name was written on the front in her precise handwriting, the same careful lettering I remembered from her school assignments, always so meticulous, so determined to get everything perfect. "Read it," she said. "Not here. Later, when you're alone." I took the envelope, feeling its weight. Not physical weight, but the emotional burden it seemed to carry. "Whatever is in here," I said, tapping it against my palm, "it doesn't justify what you're doing. Nothing could justify that." "Maybe not," she conceded, her voice suddenly tired. "But it might help you understand." We sat in silence for a moment, the air conditioning humming softly between us. There were so many more questions I wanted to ask, so many accusations I wanted to hurl at her, but something in her demeanor stopped me. For the first time in this nightmare, I saw genuine pain in her eyes. Not calculation, not manipulation, but real suffering. "I have to go," she said finally, putting her sunglasses back on. "My meeting." I nodded and opened the car door, the blast of hot air outside like walking into a wall. "Dad," she called as I was about to close the door. "Whatever you decide to do, I'll understand." It wasn't until I was back in my own car, the envelope burning a hole in my pocket, that I realized what she meant. She knew about the red folder. She knew I had evidence that could destroy her plans, and she was telling me she would accept whatever consequences came from my actions. I waited until I was home, seated in my old recliner with a glass of bourbon, my first drink in nearly a year, before I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of pale blue stationery, covered in Meredith's handwriting. As I began to read, the bourbon turned bitter in my mouth. "Dad, you think I'm destroying my brother, but he destroyed me first. That day at Lake Harmony, when I was 15 and he was 20, you saw him push me off the dock. You saw him laugh when I came up gasping for air, my new dress ruined, my first real camera destroyed. You saw it, and you looked away. You told Mom I was being dramatic when I said he'd done it on purpose. That was the day I realized you would always love him more than me. And maybe you do. Maybe that's just how it is. I'm not doing this for money, or for power, or because I enjoy watching James suffer. I'm doing it because for 20 years I've been waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up for me the way everyone always stands up for him. Stephanie came to me for help. Yes, Lily is sick. Yes, she needs treatment insurance won't cover. But that's not why Stephanie agreed to this. She agreed because James hurt her too, not with his fists, but with his words, his control, his constant belittling, the same way he hurt me all those years when no one was looking. I just wanted, for once in my life, for someone to choose my side. Maybe that person was never going to be you, Meredith. I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking more with each reading. The lake. I remembered that day. James pushing Meredith off the dock. I had seen it. I had laughed, hadn't I? Called it sibling roughhousing. Told her to lighten up when she'd stormed back to the cabin, soaking wet and furious. Had I really dismissed her pain so easily? Had I really failed to see what was happening between my children all those years? The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just facing a choice between my son and daughter now. I was facing the consequences of choices I'd made long ago. Choices to look away, to minimize, to choose the easier path of believing what I wanted to believe. What kind of father had I been? What kind of father was I now? The courtroom was suffocating on the day of the final hearing. The air conditioning had faltered in the August heat, and overhead fans stirred the stale air without providing much relief. I sat in the back row, the red folder clutched in my sweating hands, the blue letter from Meredith folded carefully in my breast pocket, right over my heart, where its weight seemed heaviest. Judge Hernandez looked tired before the proceedings even began, dark circles under his eyes as he shuffled through the papers before him. He was younger than me by a good 15 years, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses that he kept adjusting as if they never quite sat right. "All rise," the bailiff called, and I struggled to my feet along with everyone else in the packed courtroom. I caught James's eye as he stood at the defendant's table. He gave me a small, nervous smile, the same one he'd had as a boy when he was afraid he was in trouble but trying to be brave. I tried to return it, but my face felt frozen, incapable of expressing the storm raging inside me. Across the aisle, Stephanie sat with her attorney, dressed in a modest navy blue dress that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she was. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone, her eyes fixed on her folded hands. And Meredith, my daughter, sat directly behind Stephanie, her back ramrod straight, her expression unreadable. The Rolex glinted on her wrist as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. When she saw me looking, she held my gaze steadily, neither challenging nor pleading, just waiting. "We're here today in the matter of Johnston versus Jameson regarding custody of minor child Ethan James Johnston," Judge Hernandez began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed courtroom. "Before we hear testimony, are there any preliminary matters counsel would like to address?" James's attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Rebecca Goldstein, stood. "No, Your Honor." Stephanie's attorney, a balding man with an expensive suit and an overly confident demeanor, also shook his head. "No, Your Honor." "Very well. Ms. Jameson has made serious allegations of domestic abuse against Mr. Johnston, which Mr. Johnston categorically denies. These allegations will factor significantly into my custody determination." Judge Hernandez looked over his glasses at both parties. "I remind everyone that this court's primary concern is the welfare of the child. Ms. Jameson, you may take the stand." My heart hammered against my ribs as Stephanie was sworn in. This was it. The moment she would begin to recite the lies Meredith had coached her to tell. The moment that could destroy my son's life forever. Or I could stop it. The red folder seemed to burn in my hands. All I had to do was stand up, ask to approach the bench, hand over the evidence I'd collected. The text messages would speak for themselves. The judge would see the truth. James would be vindicated, and Meredith would be exposed, possibly charged with conspiracy to commit perjury. Her career as a pharmaceutical executive would be over, and any chance of healing the rift in our family would vanish forever. I thought of the lake, of looking away when James pushed Meredith, of dismissing her feelings, her pain, of 20 years of choices that had led us all to this moment. "Ms. Jameson," Stephanie's attorney began, "could you please describe for the court the first incident of physical aggression you experienced from Mr. Johnston?" Stephanie's voice was barely audible as she began to speak. "It was after Ethan's 5th birthday party. James had been drinking. I stood up before I even realized what I was doing. My cane clattered to the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet courtroom. 'Your Honor,' I called out, my voice cracking with emotion. 'I have evidence that needs to be considered before this testimony continues.' All eyes turned to me. James looked confused, then alarmed. Stephanie froze mid-sentence. And Meredith. Meredith's face drained of color as she stared at the red folder in my hands. "Sir, this is highly irregular," Judge Hernandez said, frowning. "Who are you?" "Walter Johnston, Your Honor. James's father and Ethan's grandfather." I moved forward, limping slightly without my cane. "I have information critical to these proceedings." The judge studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Approach the bench, Mr. Johnston." I walked forward on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. The distance to the bench seemed to stretch endlessly, each step heavier than the last. When I finally stood before Judge Hernandez, I placed both the red folder and Meredith's letter on the polished wood surface. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steadier now that the moment had arrived. "There are lies being told in this courtroom today, but there are also truths that have been buried for too long." I opened the red folder, displaying the screenshots of text messages between Meredith and Stephanie. These messages show that Ms. Jameson is being coached to fabricate allegations of abuse that never occurred. A murmur ran through the courtroom. I glanced back to see James staring at me in shock and dawning hope. Stephanie had covered her face with her hands. And Meredith sat perfectly still, her expression one of resignation rather than surprise. Judge Hernandez examined the messages, his frown deepening with each page he turned. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Johnston. If authentic, they constitute an attempt to perpetrate a fraud upon this court." "They're authentic, Your Honor," I confirmed, "but they're not the whole story." I opened Meredith's letter next, my fingers trembling slightly as I smoothed it out. This letter is from my daughter Meredith Johnston, who has been orchestrating this situation, but her motivations are rooted in a history that I've only recently come to understand. A history that I, as a father, failed to acknowledge for far too long. The judge read the letter silently, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked up at me with new interest. "Mr. Johnston," he said quietly, "what exactly are you asking this court to do?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decades of family history pressing down on me. "I'm asking for the truth, Your Honor. Not just about whether these specific allegations of abuse are fabricated, which they are, but about the deeper patterns of harm that have been present in my family for years. Patterns I turned a blind eye to. Patterns that have led us here today." I gestured to the courtroom behind me. "My son is not a violent man. He does not deserve to lose his child based on false accusations. But my daughter's pain is real, even if her methods of addressing it are deeply wrong. And Stephanie's experiences with my son may include forms of harm that don't leave physical marks but are damaging nonetheless. This isn't just about custody anymore, is it, Mr. Johnston?" Judge Hernandez asked perceptively. "No, Your Honor," I admitted. "It's about a family that's been broken for longer than any of us were willing to admit, and about whether there's any hope of healing those breaks rather than deepening them." Judge Hernandez considered me for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "This hearing will be suspended," he announced to the courtroom, "based on the evidence presented by Mr. Johnston. There are sufficient grounds to question the veracity of the allegations before the court, as well as the motivations behind this custody dispute." He turned to the attorneys. "I'm ordering a complete evaluation by a court-appointed family therapist before these proceedings continue. In the meantime, Mr. Johnston and Ms. Jameson will share temporary custody of their son, with supervised visitation only." The gavel came down with finality, and the courtroom erupted in whispers and movement. I stood there, suddenly empty-handed, the red folder and the blue letter now part of the court record, part of our family's permanent history. As I turned to go back to my seat, I caught sight of Meredith's face. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since that day at the lake, I saw my daughter's armor crack. A single tear slid down her cheek, quickly wiped away, but not before I witnessed it. Not before I recognized it for what it was. Not anger, not manipulation, but relief. Relief that someone had finally seen her pain, even as they rejected her methods of dealing with it. And in that moment, despite everything still unresolved between us, I felt the faintest flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, our family wasn't beyond saving after all. 2 months passed like a slow-moving river, carving new channels through the landscape of our lives. Autumn arrived in Philadelphia with a kaleidoscope of red and gold leaves that reminded me of Meredith's hair when she was young, before she started dyeing it that severe black that matched her corporate wardrobe. The court-ordered family therapy had been grueling. Week after week, sitting in Dr. Levine's office with its 2 soft couches and abstract paintings that looked like someone had spilled coffee on canvas and called it art. James and Stephanie on one side of the room, Meredith on another, me somewhere in the middle. A physical manifestation of the emotional geography of our family. Things had emerged in those sessions, painful things that had been buried beneath layers of resentment and misunderstanding. James admitted to being emotionally distant, to using his intelligence as a weapon, to making Stephanie feel small without ever raising a hand to her. Stephanie confessed that she'd known the domestic violence claims were false, but that she'd felt so beaten down in other ways that it had seemed justified somehow. And Meredith, my daughter, finally spoke about years of feeling invisible next to her brilliant brother, about the incident at the lake being just one of many times she'd felt I'd chosen him over her. Every science fair, every college acceptance, every job offer, she'd said, her voice tight with old pain. It was always James who got the champagne toasts. I got "That's nice, honey." I'd wept openly during that session, the realization of my failures as a father crushing me. All those years I'd thought I was being even-handed, treating them the same. But I hadn't wanted to see, how my pride in James had overshadowed my daughter, how my casual dismissal of her pain had taught her that the only way to be seen was to create destruction big enough that no one could ignore it. Today, Meredith was coming to visit me for the first time since the court hearing. She'd been keeping her distance, communicating mostly through text messages or brief phone calls. But yesterday she'd called and asked if she could come over. "Just to talk," she'd said, her voice carefully neutral. I spent the morning cleaning my small apartment with an energy I hadn't felt in months, dusting the bookshelves where Margaret's collection of bird figurines still perched, vacuuming the carpet that had seen better days, making a fresh pot of coffee and setting out the oatmeal cookies Meredith had always loved as a child, though I doubted she'd touch them now. At precisely 2 p.m. the doorbell rang. I opened it to find my daughter standing there looking both familiar and strange. She'd cut her hair, a short bob that framed her face in a way that reminded me painfully of her mother. She wore jeans and a simple blue sweater instead of her usual business attire, and there was something different in her eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen in decades. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. "Come in," I replied, stepping aside to let her enter. She walked into the living room, glancing around as if seeing it for the first time, though she'd been here countless times before. She sat in the same chair where she used to curl up as a child, listening to me read stories from the old leather-bound collection of Grimm's fairy tales. The chair seemed to swallow her now, making her look smaller, more fragile. "Coffee?" I offered, already moving toward the kitchen. "Just water, thanks." When I returned with a glass of water for her and coffee for myself, she was holding one of the picture frames from the side table, a photo of all 4 of us at the Grand Canyon, James 12 and Meredith 7, both sunburned and grinning with Margaret and me behind them, our hands on their shoulders. "I don't remember us ever being this happy," she said, setting the frame back down carefully. "We were sometimes," I replied, settling onto the couch across from her. "Not always, but sometimes." Silence stretched between us, not exactly uncomfortable but heavy with all the things we'd never said to each other. "I know what you did was right," Meredith finally said, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. "At the court, with the texts and the letter, I know that." I waited, sensing there was more. "But I don't know if I can forgive you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not for that day, but for all the days before, all the times you looked away, all the times you chose not to see." The words struck me like physical blows, each one landing with precision on the tender places of my conscience. But I didn't defend myself. I didn't try to explain or justify. I just nodded. "I understand," I said simply. "Do you?" Her eyes met mine, challenging. "Do you really understand what it was like to be your daughter? To always be second best? To know that no matter what I achieved, it would never measure up to the great James Johnston?" "No," I admitted. "I don't. I can't. But I'm trying to learn, to listen, to see you, really see you, the way I should have all along." She looked away, blinking rapidly. "I can't call you Dad anymore," she said after a moment. "Not right now. It doesn't feel real, not after everything." Though I'd been expecting it, the words still cut deep. I nodded again, not trusting myself to speak. "I'm starting therapy," she continued. "Not just the family sessions with Dr. Levine, individual therapy. I need to understand why I did what I did, why I was willing to hurt so many people just to be seen." "That's good," I managed. "That's really good, Meredith. And I've set up a trust for Lily's treatment," she added. "No strings attached. Stephanie can hate me forever if she wants, but the money will be there for as long as Lily needs it." My chest tightened with a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow. "You're doing the right thing." "Am I?" She laughed bitterly. "I don't even know what that means anymore." She stood abruptly, setting her untouched water on the coffee table. "I should go. I have a meeting at 4. I rose as well, my knees protesting. Of course. She gathered her purse and jacket, moving toward the door with the brisk efficiency I'd grown accustomed to seeing in her. But at the threshold, she hesitated. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said again, her back to me. "And I don't expect you to forgive me either. But I'm glad you did what you did. I'm glad someone finally saw the truth. All of it, not just the parts that were convenient." She turned slightly, not quite looking at me. That's worth more than any hug or any reconciliation speech right now. After she left, I found a small folded note on the side table where she'd been sitting. My name was written on the outside in her precise handwriting. Inside was a single sentence. "You were the only one who saw, and that means more than you'll ever know." I sat back down heavily, the note trembling in my fingers. Outside, autumn winds scattered leaves across the courtyard, a reminder that seasons change, that nothing remains as it is forever. My family now exists in a landscape of silence and memory, fractured but not destroyed. James and I speak regularly, though there's a new caution in his voice, a recognition that his father is not the man he thought he knew. Stephanie and I exchange polite messages about Ethan, whose nightmares have finally begun to fade. I've even met Lily, a fierce little warrior with her mother's eyes and a determination that cancer will not define her life. And Meredith, we're finding our way, step by hesitant step, through terrain neither of us has mapped before. I don't know if we'll ever be whole again. I don't know if forgiveness is possible after so many years of accumulated pain, but I do know this. I am the man who chose truth when everything else was drowning in lies. The man who finally opened his eyes after decades of selective blindness. And even if no one ever thanks me for it, even if reconciliation remains forever just beyond reach, I will carry that knowledge with me into whatever years I have left. Sometimes love means making the hardest choice of all, choosing to see clearly, even when the truth breaks your heart. As Walter's story comes to a close, I find myself wondering, what would you have done with that red folder? Would you have exposed the lies to save your son, knowing it would destroy your daughter? Or would you have remained silent, allowing injustice to prevail in the name of family peace? The hardest truths are often the ones closest to our hearts, the ones we've spent a lifetime looking away from. Sometimes love requires us to make impossible choices, to stand in the gap between justice and mercy, to acknowledge that healing doesn't always look like forgiveness, and that some wounds take generations to mend. Walter chose truth, even when it broke his heart. He chose to see his children, truly see them, perhaps for the first time. And in doing so, he offered them something more valuable than blind loyalty or easy absolution. He offered them the dignity of being known. If this story touched something in you today, if it made you think about the silences in your own family or the truths you might be afraid to face, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories that illuminate the complicated beauty of being human, and leave a comment telling us what you would have done in Walter's place. Because sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is simply bear witness to each other's pain.